what is sometimes called inverse perspective in Byzantine icon painting is a particular case of the broader question about how space and time are represented in the art of different cultures and different times and styles. The Byzantine icons are paintings that developed in the Greek-speaking Roman Empire. And they go back to the early centuries of Christianity and come from the thought and reflections of the early Christians. And two of the main sources for the thought behind these Greek Christian paintings are first, of course, the Bible, and another source is Plato. So after looking at some examples of this inverse perspective, I'll give some reasons for it from both the Bible and from Plato. Looking at some examples of Byzantine icon paintings, and noticing especially elements such as building, tables, chairs, books, and in a way also some of the landscape elements such as the mountains. One might think at first, as my students often do, that the artist really messed up the drawing, the perspective, the space, and the orientation of things in space. Looking at a particular example, a simple one, such as a book. So a saint holding a book, you notice that the back edges of the book are larger than the front, than the edges that are closer to the viewer. So the book looks very distorted. Ordinarily, if as an art student you learn perspective, one of the first things you learn and are taught to notice is that in the way things visually appear is that something like a cube or a box, the edges that are further from us seem to be smaller than the edges that are closer. And in Renaissance paintings, they use this very often to create on the flat surface an illusion of distance and depth and of objects receding from the viewer. But in the icons, not always and not as an absolute rule, but often they will do the opposite. The part of the object that is further from the viewer, instead of getting smaller as it appears to do to us, will actually be drawn larger, as if the object is kind of expanding away from us. And for that reason, this is called both reverse perspective or inverse perspective, because they seem to be doing the reverse of what ordinarily appears to us in perspective and what perspective drawing teaches, that things, instead of things getting smaller as they go in the distance, the icon painters will sometimes make them bigger in the distance and smaller as they are closer to the viewer. Now, sometimes I have heard or read some strange ideas about this, that in the Renaissance, when we see more paintings with this single viewpoint perspective where things are getting smaller as they get seem to go off into the distance. Sometimes it's said that there must have been some sort of awakening or transformation of human consciousness. I have even seen it written that people suggest that humans didn't really see perspective before the Renaissance, and somehow something happened and people started to see perspective, which certainly isn't true. And it's really simply a matter of choice. The artist's choice, the culture's artistic choice of what and how they want to represent in their paintings. I'll take one example that I think will help diffuse this false idea that somehow people suddenly started to see perspective, or even another idea, maybe less wild, is that artists just weren't very good. They just didn't know how to draw before the Renaissance in the West. But that's not correct either, as one can verify simply by looking at ancient works of art. But there's an interesting example that we have. We have a writing from the Song Dynasty China, so somewhere around 1000 AD. So hundreds, almost 500 years before the Renaissance, 400 or 500 years before. And an artist was starting to draw more in perspective and use perspective and lines and maybe some kind of horizon or vanishing points, and he is criticized for this, and the Chinese reject this as something they want to focus on and develop in their art. So it shows that they were aware of it and they chose not to develop it, which raises the question, which I would actually like to focus on in its own video, of why Europe at the time of the Renaissance chose to focus on perspective and single viewpoint perspective. What led to that choice, since it was a choice to focus on something that other times and cultures have not been interested in. So let's look at this text. It's by a writer, Shen Gua, and he's talking about the work of an artist, Li Qing, who is introducing what we would call perspective into his painting. And here's what Shen Gua wrote. He said, "All landscapes have to be viewed from the angle of totality in order to behold the part." So I think this also will help us in part to understand the Byzantine paintings, this idea of the angle of totality. But let's go on. All landscapes have to be viewed from the angle of totality in order to behold the part. If we apply Li's method to the painting of real mountains, this single viewpoint perspective, we are unable to see more than one layer of the mountain at a time. Could that be called art? Li Qing surely does not understand the principle of viewing the part from the angle of totality. His measurement of height and distance is certainly a fine thing, but should one attach paramount importance to the angles and corners of buildings? In Chinese painting, often the practice of the artist who, for example, wanted to paint a mountain was for the artist to go out and walk up and around the mountain, along the paths, and then come back home, go inside, sit down, and paint the mountain from memory, and often include a poem about the mountain, about the artist's experience of the mountain. And this is different from what we often see now of Western landscape painters. The normal thing would be to take an easel out, find a spot where you can view the mountain, and from that one spot draw exactly what you see. The shape of the mountain, and even often limiting it to one particular time of day. The light on the mountain in the morning or in the evening, and so you get the shadows that you see at a certain time and the one particular viewpoint that you see from one spot. Whereas the Chinese painter is painting from memory, and from a memory of walking through and around the mountain, so from many different perspectives and angles. And I think this is what Shenghua calls the angle of totality. And he's saying, well, why restrict yourself to one particular viewpoint, one partial view, when you can look at the mountain from many views and include many aspects and layers of the mountain in your painting. And then the viewer can contemplate the painting and see different sides and different places and different aspects of the mountain. And sometimes in the painting there will be no shadows. So you don't, it's not from any one particular time, but it's a kind of a diffuse time and a diffuse point of view of the mountain. And so Shenghua and the Chinese decided that, well, that was a better way. That was more artistic, more poetic, more expansive, human, inclusive way of painting from this angle, or we could say perspective, of totality rather than a partial, limited, single perspective. So this is one example, but it shows that it's certainly not right to say that somehow other artists just didn't understand perspective, or didn't know how to draw, or didn't even perceive perspective. Because here we have a documented example of the Chinese understanding it, trying it, and deciding that no, that's not what they wanted to do in their art. The Byzantine paintings have some of that too, that angle of totality, the multiple viewpoints is one way we can look at it, that you're seeing things, you're not seeing the scene, the objects represented from just one definite viewpoint, but it's as if you're in one picture you're looking at things from multiple points of view or perspective. And this, I think, ties in some ways with some of the biblical perspective. In the writings of the Bible, when they're telling a story, what modern Bible scholars have pointed out, but also the ancient Christian scholars, such as St. Augustine of Africa, pointed out and observed that the Bible, though you might read it in succession through time as if it's chronological, the writer, without informing you, will shift points of time, viewpoints in time, and might be telling an incident and all of a sudden jump back to an earlier point of time and start retelling it from a different perspective. And Augustine said, people who don't realize that the Bible has some of these unusual ways of writing and isn't a strict historical chronology all the time, will have often difficulties understanding. And he said, though, the Bible, the writer, in the same passage will shift not only temporal points of view, but kind of genres or points of view, say, looking at something historically, and then we'll shift into looking at it symbolically. So maybe talking about historical city and historical king, and then talking about the same city and the same king in a symbolic way, as if they represent other things, and then we'll talk about it on the symbolic level, and then we'll jump back to the historical perspective. And so that shifting, like say, telling about something from multiple viewpoints in the same account, and not announcing that, just freely moving between different points of view, I think has some visual analogy in the icon paintings, that different objects are looked at from different points of view. It's as if you are a consciousness that can move through space and look at the same thing from different viewpoints simultaneously. So it's a more maybe transcendent kind of consciousness that is being represented. Another aspect of the icons that derives from the Bible that I think can help understand their representation of things in space is the idea from the Bible that ultimately the world, the universe, and humans will exist in a different form, a more timeless dimension. And one of the ways the Bible talks about this is to say there will be no need for the sun or the moon, these sources of light that give us time and that move, because there will be a permeating light, a kind of divine light that is in, through, and around things that will allow us to see them and without there being the sun. So in the icon paintings, nothing casts a shadow. And that was one way of representing this vision, that the things in the icons are being viewed from within this other kind of light, this light that is pervasive and inner and coming from within and all-pervading. So the background of the icons, where, say, the sky would normally be, is often pure gold. It's not even paint, it's gold leaf, the metal, actual real gold. So instead of there being a sky with clouds and a sun, there is this all-pervading, diffusive background of gold, and in the normal context in which these paintings would be seen, this gold would look like light was coming out from within the painting and outwards from the painting, because there'd be candles and the gold will be reflecting the candles, so it looks like there's light coming from behind and out of the painting, so that this gold background is representing that an all-present light in which things are bathed and seen, and out of which they are being crystallized. So the objects and figures in the painting are as if being crystallized out of this background of all-pervasive light. So the highlights will often be painted in a stylized form of crystals, and the paint, the egg timber paint, will be layered, sometimes in a transparent way of transparent layers, so as if these objects really are crystalline and there's a light coming from within and through them. So that gives some reasons for this style, this inverse perspective from the Bible. And we can also look at some reasons that come from Plato, who was very influential in early Christian thinkers, and especially the Greek-speaking Christianity. Plato wrote many conversations, and that's mostly what we have from Plato, besides some letters, are these descriptions of conversations among Greeks, often including Socrates, but sometimes not. And these are sometimes called dialogues, but more properly they're conversations. And in one of these conversations that goes by the name of Protagoras, because of the man Protagoras, who is a main figure in this conversation. Protagoras and Socrates at one point get into a discussion about the question of evil, or an aspect of the question of evil, but very down to earth, that everyone experiences in themselves and in others events where we choose something that seems pleasurable and maybe is pleasurable, often a very brief pleasure, but that leads to very extensive misery and pain. Someone might drink too much because they want to feel good, and they end up feeling horrible for an extended length of time, the next day, or if they're alcoholic, it may be months and years. Or someone is unfaithful to their partner, and it's a brief time of pleasure, and it leads to years of misery and pain, and people will regret this, and sometimes it leads to years in jail for something very momentary. And in the discussion, it suggested, well, they are kind of overcome by pleasure. I say, well, people say that the person was overcome by a pleasure and ended up making a bad choice that actually led to much more misery than it did pleasure, that the misery quite outweighs the pleasure. So why would someone do this, and why do people do this? And on the other hand, people too also avoid something good that will lead maybe to extensive amount of pleasure because there's a little bit of pain involved. And so they're questioning, well, why do humans do this? What's the explanation? It would seem, if people understood things and acted rationally, they would just compare, say, hey, do you want, if you can have this 1 hour pleasant 1 hour of pleasure, but 100 hours of misery and pain, would you make that choice? It would seem obviously not. Or you'll have the short pain, maybe an operation, a surgery, but then you'll have years of pleasure from it, and someone might be afraid of it. So Socrates offers a suggestion to explain this, and in the suggestion he makes a very interesting comparison, and he uses perspective in it. And he compares space to time, and says, just as things in space, things that are closer appear bigger than things that are distant, even though they're not. They might be smaller. So in time, things that are closer in time appear bigger than things that are further in time. You can take a quarter and hold it up, and it will look equal or larger than the sun. But obviously the sun is immensely larger than a quarter. But it appears to us that the quarter is larger even than the sun. So things that are closer appear larger than things that are further away, even though that's not the way they really are. And Socrates says, well, it seems like the same thing happens with time, too. There's this kind of perspective distortion in time, that things that are close in time look bigger than things that are further away. So the pleasure this evening, this short, small pleasure this evening, will look bigger than the extensive, long pain tomorrow or days later. So that's an interesting explanation, that he says there's a distortion of perspective in both time and space. So this shows us that perspective, as this appearance of things being bigger, and even maybe more important, if we include the time, insofar as they're closer to us individually and our limited viewpoint, and smaller or even less important as they are distant from us and our particular viewpoint, that this is an illusion. It's not really the way things are. And that's one of the things that Socrates offers as a solution. He says that people need to be taught some sort of art of measurement so they can look at things not from the distortion of perspective, which is an illusory appearance, that things closer look bigger or more important or more pleasant than things distant in space or time, but that people need some sort of art of measuring things as they really are, in the amount of pleasure and pain and goodness and badness and size that they really have. So then perspective, sometimes it's said that drawing things in according to their appearance in perspective is more realistic. But from this point of view of this dialogue of Plato, we can see that perspective is an illusion. It's not the way things really are, it's just the way things appear to us. So the icon painters were interested in truth, somehow representing more the way things really are and helping us have that art of measurement. You could say, well, why be so interested in reproducing the illusions of and the false appearance of perspective? Maybe our art is more interested in showing us not the way things appear, but the way they really are. And then how would we do that? And so the icon painters will do the reverse of apparent perspective. So sometimes make the farther side of the object look bigger. I think and as one way of saying, well, the order of things in reality, the hierarchy of the cosmos and the order of things in that reality is not the same as they appear to us. And sometimes things that are distant to us in our individual perspective are actually the greater, more important, and better things. And Plato's greatest student, Aristotle, who studied with Plato at his school for 20 years, and Aristotle makes that same point. He says the order that things have in our knowledge and thought is not the same as the order that things have in being. So he says the things that are most knowable in themselves are not always the things most knowable to us. So that the divine nature is, as he would put it, the most knowable thing in itself. It has the most to be known, it has the most reality, but it's least knowable to us. It's even hard for people to sometimes be certain that it even exists. So we could also say the things that are most real to us are not the most real things. Even on the level of matter, the first principles of matter are not the first things known to us about material things. So the first principles of matter, say the subatomic particles, and even if there's further principles that are, the first principles of material things are the last things for us to know about matter. So what is first in being in reality, even in this material level, is sometimes the last in our knowledge. We know the effects, and we go back to the causes in our knowledge. That's our perspective. But it's not the way things are. The way things are is first the causes, then the effects. Aristotle says, even in goodness, the things that are best in themselves are not what seem best to us. They're not the most desired by us, even though they're the most desirable in themselves. So children, the most desirable thing might be candy or soda pops. They might desire that more than wisdom or knowledge or deep and more difficult forms of intimacy between people. So the best things, the most desirable things, are not always the most desirable to us, or even the union with the divine, timeless union with infinite consciousness. That's not always the most desired thing, or the thing that people seek the most and think is the best thing. Sometimes the things that people seek more are much less good than what is really good in itself. We see then, in many ways, all these examples show us that our perspective on things is not the way things really are. And so Socrates was suggesting, well, how do we adjust that? How do we see the way things really are, and then order our minds and our wills and desires to the way things really are, not to the false appearance, our individual perspective. And so the icon painters had one way of kind of touching on that issue and reminding us by just making things in a reverse perspective or inverse perspective. They are reminding us that often the things that are more real, that are better, are not the things that appear most real and best to us. And things are not always ordered in importance according to how close they are to us. So in individual perspective, things have their size and importance simply in relation to me and my place in space and time. But the icon is trying to raise up and get a more transcendent perspective, which the Chinese too were trying, from what they call the angle of totality, the perspective of totality, a more universal perspective.